My name's Lee Petty, and I'm the director of Keeper. And today we're going to show you some behind-the-scenes footage here of some of the techniques and the way we built the world of Keeper inside Unreal Engine. What we're looking at right now is the game running right here in the editor. You can see that I'm playing the game right here. But if I escape out of this, we're actually in the edit mode. And so this is the, what we call, when you play inside the editor, we call it Pi, play in editor. And what we're looking at is actually what the developers look like while putting this game together. Now, we have a lot of different types of objects that are organized here, some of which are turned off. So you can see that, for example, I've turned off collision, but if we turn on collision, you can see some of our collision objects. Same with camera. If I turn on camera, you can see there's a lot more. Well, maybe you didn't see it there, but a lot of these splines are cameras and other paths. So what I want to show you, though, that's really interesting, I always find this super interesting when I see footage of other people's games, is you know what it looks like when you're playing it. But what does it look like when you start panning around and you're sort of seeing, in our case, this area of the game, the camera was kind of tracking the player like this. So we didn't really need to build what was out of here. Now, you might ask, well, why is there even anything out there? And sometimes these are helper objects. Sometimes these are things that we want to cast shadows, which is the case here. So some of these simple collections of objects are casting shadows. And the other really interesting thing is to look at our game with maybe, say, lighting turned off. So you can look at a completely unlit representation of the game. You can see how much lighting and atmosphere contributes to the overall experience of the game. You could even look at the wireframe, and you can see how dense some of this stuff winds up being. We are using Nanite, which is a feature of the Unreal Engine 5 specifically, that allows you to use very dense mesh. And that was important to us because we sort of hand sculpted a lot of our environment, and we really wanted that feeling. You can see we can get nice and close here. You can even see we even have these sort of like brush and rake marks on the objects. You can see that we've got these little brush strokes out in the environment as well. You can see if I select one, I'm going to select all of them in this area here. It's pretty interesting to see it this way. And what I want to do is kind of walk you through a little bit, just to show you a little like what some of our levels look in different parts of the game. But also I want to show you a little bit about lighting, because I think lighting is a really interesting one to show, because you can see the changes happen right in front of you, because all of our lighting is dynamic, and we built several custom systems to support the look of the game and the way we wanted to light it. So this level is Act 1, Region 3. So it's the third level of the game, and you're playing the lighthouse, and I'm going to pan way out for a second so you can see that this level is actually made up of a few different pieces. So you start off here working your way through an area we call the Hall of Elders. And the last part of this puzzle here has you opening a portal. I'll move into this room here. Has you opening a portal over here that takes you out to the pollen fields. Those both exist in the same level, but there's the pollen field. So I'm going to move over there just to show you that, very different area of the game. And you kind of get sort of teleported out to, let's see, shortcut to right here, which is, if I again pan back, you can see this whole area. Now, again, this is dynamic, as in the camera was following the player around, but the camera in this area did not allow the player just to freely look all the way over here. So there isn't really anything over there, but the player could look up and around a lot this area. And for this level, the player kind of works their way all the way up through these levels, and you see they're all actually connected to each other. This whole pollen field area, all the way up here, gets through a bunch of puzzles, and then eventually comes up to here. And you can see as I'm moving through these different areas, the lighting and wind and climate are all shifting in real time as I'm moving through here. And that's because a lot of this changes regionally based on where the camera is. But I want to show you a little bit more, which is kind of interesting. So if we pick, let's just say we go out to this main area in the pollen fields here. So if I turn again, just out of curiosity, if we turn off the lighting, this is what it looks like with no lighting or atmosphere. You can still see some particle effects in this view. Or another one that's really interesting to look at is what Unreal calls detail lighting. So this is just the lighting and normal maps and some things like that, but no base color textures. So you can kind of see the lighting. And then when, of course, you go to lit here, this is like the full boat, everything the player would see. In Unreal by default, and in a lot of game engines, you have, a sun, and we have a sun up there, and that drives a lot of the lighting. But because our game varies so much within a level and we're shifting where the sun is, kind of sometimes behind the scenes, and we're really trying to grade and the colors quite differently from area, we had to come up with our own system to help change those regionally. And this system was originally developed for Psychonauts 2. It's called the WEV system, or the World Environment Volume. And Aaron Jacobs is the one who originally put it together. And if you look at, you'll see that in our game, we have a lot of these things called WEVs. And you see here, they're all kind of named. We do have debug tools to let you know as a developer what WEV is active in any given area. But I know from this area. So for example, this WEV is in the pollen field. The lowlands is what we call this first area. And it lets us change a lot of things. We can change the sun, the height fog, the sky atmosphere, volumetric clouds, skylight, all that sort of stuff dynamically. So for example, if I grab the directional light rotation, you can see like I can just rotate the sun here in real time, and you can see the effect it's having on the game. It all kind of works. It's all dynamic. We don't bake any lighting down in the game. So this object here is our own. We sort of develop, if I get out a little close to it, it's our own brushy sun. It's a little hard to get way close to because it's way the hell up there. So if I fly outside our WV volume, you can kind of see even the clouds change there. Oops, I went a little too far. Let me go back here a little. So one of the funny things is you'll see as I fly around here, the exposure changes as well, because the exposure changes a bit based on what you're looking at. So if I look right at the sun, you'll see other parts of the frame dark. And if I look in a dark area, it brightens a bit. And that also changes quite a bit depending on where you're flying. But yeah, if I change the suns here, you can see the clouds are affected. You can see the colors in the environment are affected. The way the sun scatters through the fog is affected. The water that's out there is being affected. All those things are being affected. And so for our game in the outdoor areas, this would be kind of a baseline that we would just sort of establish as where the direct sun is coming from, where the direct light's coming from, where the sun is positioned. But we could do a lot more than just change the sun's position. Just even in the sun itself, we could change the intensity, change the light color. So if we wanted it to be this really unpleasant green, actually that looks kind of cool. We could blow it out. Now, we do have exposure control here, so it stops the screen from just turning to white because we're still limiting the exposure of the scene, but it does have an effect on it. It has a volumetric scattering ability, so a lot of those sort of what is often called God rays scattering through there. If I increase this number, you'll see that they become even stronger, or if I turn this number off, go away. So we have a lot of those. Source angle controls how sharp the shadows are. There's a lot of other things. These can control the sun disk it looks like. There's really a ton of control. But this is just the direct light, right? So if I may undo this a little bit to get back to closer to our original look here. Okay, so if I go skylight is another one of those, and this controls, like if I turn this off, you'll see that this is controlling how much light is kind of bouncing from. There's still light coming from the atmosphere, and this is sort of a cheat, if you will, but this basically is sort of a way to influence the bounce light in the scene. You could think of it that way. Now, a lot of these controls I'm showing you, these features, these are built into Unreal, but what our piece of the puzzle is that we put them all into this WEV system. So it's a volume we place in the world. So if I show you this volume right here is the volume for all those settings. And as we move out of that volume to another volume, it will blend all of those attributes, anything, any part of the skylight, any part of the volumetric clouds, any part of the sun, it seamlessly blends them to new settings in different areas. So if we go from the lowlands to the midlands, or probably a really good one to show you is if we go to, let's see. Yeah, you can see how disorienting it can be flying around here, huh? So this is the midlands right here. And if we go from the midlands, behind this waterfall, spoilers everyone, there's a secret cave, all right? It's not really much of a secret since we have a puzzle to solve to get into it, but, and this cave has its own WV setting. So if I, for example, let's just grab this waterfall object here if I can. I'm going to try and hide it. I'm grabbing all the particle effects in the way. Okay, so if I go inside here and I turn around and I slowly fly out, you can see what's happening here as I fly out. All those settings are changing, right? And so that's our system in action there, and that's because we wanted this really like very different feel inside here, and we really ramped the fog up. But of course, if we were that foggy when we're outside, we just fog out the whole world. Now that's one aspect of our lighting is this sort of WV system, and those are the basic building block for establishing the look and mood of each area. However, we also Unreal has another system called the post-process volume, which we abbreviate as PPVs, and we use those as well. And then the post-process volumes are used to do things like set your camera exposure per area. You can do color grading with them. Now, we don't do a lot of color grading in post. Most of the lighting you see in our game is actually coming from lights and materials and bounce lighting. We don't do a lot of like heavy color correction at the end. It's just sort of a stylistic choice I made for this game to not do that. However, we do some. And one of the ones that I really like is what's called a LUT, or a lookup table. These are little custom textures you can make that control the way the colors behave under different lighting circumstances. You can think of it that way. So for example, if I go into, let's go into that cave. So I'm going to grab the post-process volume from that cave. I'm going to go in here. Okay. So now if you look closely at this, this is a pretty simple lighting arrangement here. What I'm going to do just to demonstrate this point, there's a spotlight up here, and I'm going to just increase the intensity of this light to make it brighter. So I'll just make it a little bit brighter here. Okay. So now you can see what's going on down here a little more clearly. So if I go back to that post-process volume, I'm going to go down to our LUT. Again, that's that lookup table texture that we made. And you see it has this sort of percent here. So if I turn this all the way off versus all the way on, so if I turn it off, what you can see here, and these are meant to be kind of subtle. This LUT in particular, let me get in here a little closer. Okay, so I'm here really close. This is with it off. Where it was by default was here. So you can see a little more saturation, but if you look really carefully, what we're doing with this is we're actually only saturating the lighting where the light starts to fall off. That's called the terminator in art terms, right? So if I boost this all the way to, say, near 100, and you look at our shadows here, if you look around the edge of the shadow, you see that, oh my gosh, it's so hard to zoom in here. Here we go. You see that saturation line? Now, if I were to turn the LUT off, this is what Unreal lighting look like by default without this. Oh, that's still got some. Let me just put this to 0. You see that just kind of falls off in a very sort of analytical way. It's still pleasant, but I created these LUTs for different areas, and I usually have them set to fairly low values just so you get a bit of a hue and saturation shift on where light starts to fall off to darkness. And what that does is it adds a painterly richness to all the lighting in a subtle way. It doesn't require you to go through and texture that very specifically. There's a lot of other things you can do with LUT. You know, you could make, so this is a really blown out to 1. You could see the effect really solid here. Like this would be too much probably. But I have, you know, I made a bunch of different LUT textures, and they all do different things. Some of these are, you know, like here's one from the end of the game that gets a very sort of psychedelic feel. And of course you can change this in real time. This is actually totally remapping the palette of these colors to different ones, but only again, where it's being lit really strongly, and where it's not being lit strongly, it falls off to this kind of like black velvet lighting sort of thing. These are like the most heavy-handed tools, and they're best used in small amounts, but they are an important part of the process that just adds a little extra something when using the right amount. And again, if you start to fly out here, you'll see the post-process volumes also blend away, and the WV blends away, and we start to go back to the lighting here. Now, in addition to that, we have a lot of local lights. And so these are lights that are placed throughout the game for very specific effects. And we have our own custom system for this, as well as Unreal's built-in lighting. And I'll tell you why in a minute. So what we're looking at here is Unreal 5 is this really cool system called Lumen. And what Lumen does is it generates colors, bounce lighting for you. So if you were in like a totally dark room and you added a light, which I could probably demonstrate to you. Let me see. Let's go to an earlier part of the level. Okay. So this, wait for the exposure to catch up here. Okay. So this part of the level is pretty dark. Now, if I'm going to add just a standard spotlight into this. This is just built into Unreal. Okay. So you see now, in a game engine where you don't have any bounce light, you wouldn't be seeing this happen here. You see that's happening in real time. Like if I turn this off, if I keep increasing it, this is bounce lighting happen that Lumen is calculating on the fly, right? So if I change this color, you'll see that influence as well. All right, so that's some of the magic of Unreal 5. Now, of course, you see the color shifting within that light and stuff, and that's our own WVs and LUTs and so on and so forth. But that's primarily what Lumen does. Unfortunately, when you're doing a non-realistic game, you want to do like a stylized game, you want to place a lot of lights around for different effects, because we were going for more of a theatrical stage movie lighting scheme in some ways. We weren't going for completely realistic lighting. And that requires you to place a bunch of additional lights. But as with all game engines, placing a bunch of lights, especially if they're shadow casting, like all of our lights are, you can only place a few before they get too expensive to place a lot. So what we needed was an ability to place additional lights. We do sometimes use spotlights, but we have hundreds, if not thousands, of additional lights placed in our levels to get a certain look. All right. Oh, I hit the delete button. All right, so what happens when you hit the delete button for the first time is you see Unreal looks at all the references in your level to make sure that if you're deleting something that affects other objects or is dependent on other objects, it tells you. So I just hit the delete button. So it only does it this first time you do it. It takes a little while. But once this is done, you probably fast forward past this. Yeah, I forgot. It's an instinct, right? You're like, I placed this thing. The funny part is if I just undid the placement, it wouldn't do this. Okay. All right, so getting back to it. So we wanted to place a bunch of additional lights in the scene, and we couldn't just use standard Unreal shadow casting lights, and we didn't want to use non-shadow casting lights. Non-shadow casting lights just don't have the same presence in the environment or on the characters. So we made our own custom Lumen lights that leverage Lumen, and they're basically free. And what they are is, in our case, if in our version of Unreal, if I go to Lumen, here you'll see that we have these Lumen virtual lights that we can place, okay? So I'll show you what they look like. So by default, it comes in pretty big. Now these lights have their own special light type. So the common one I use is card. So you can see this is like having a softbox or a barn door sort of light. And you can aim this light based on this card. And they're not as crisp as, say, a spotlight because it just uses Lumen's level of resolution. But you can use them for really subtle color changes everywhere. And they do cast shadows. They can affect volumetric light. But we can put in basically any number of these in a scene. And you know, one of the first ones I wanted was something like this, so I can kind of light it like you might light a set, where you're not just putting a spotlight or you're not doing a big point light that affects everything in the scene. And we also can do things like change the aspect ratio on these so that you can make it kind of any size you want. Of course, you can make the size different. There you go. So you can kind of do that. But we have, so if you look at in our levels, we have we have a lot of extra lights that are placed. So even in places where you wouldn't expect them, like if we go to kind of like this outdoor environment, actually go back to the area we were just looking at, I'll show you. All right, so sometimes, you know, you of course want your levels to actually be playable, and so that's always the balance of lighting, drama, but also playable. So sometimes you'll see, here's a Lumen light that's just placed in the scene that is kind of invisible to the player's eye, right? But what it's actually doing, like if I turn this off, it's actually highlighting the path that we want you to take initially. It's helping you find, like, get up on top of this thing so you don't just kind of bump into it and bounce off it, like, what is that thing? And there are a bunch of those placed. What you're seeing in this editor isn't necessarily an exact representation of what it looks like at runtime, because there are a few objects that are animating and affecting shadows, but it gives you a pretty good idea. And we have a lot of those placed in the level, sometimes for mood, sometimes they're just for clarity throughout the game. And that, by using our custom Lumen system, we were able to add any number of those.
You said that these lights are essentially free.
Yeah.
How is that working?
Well, once you're paying for Lumen, you can, so how I originally came up with this idea was if you just put an emissive object in the world, like, so let's just say we just take Unreal's, we'll just take a basic, let's just take a cube. All right, so just taking a cube, and if I find a glow texture, I'm sure we have some here. Let's just take, I'll just type in glow, I'm sure we'll find a glow texture in here. Okay, so this is just an emissive object. But you can see, it's a little hard maybe to see in this exact lighting environment, but you can see, there you go. You can see that an emissive object, because of Lumen, actually affects lights around it. Emissive objects aren't lights. This is just part of Lumen. So I can just keep adding a million of these to the scene, and you basically get the you know, I was like, well, why don't we just light this way? Why don't I just do our basic color scheme and lighting using these invisible objects? Now the problem, or these emissive objects, the problem is it works from a prototype standpoint. You can kind of see it as valuable, but of course you don't want to stare at the light source all the time. There might be cases where you do want to see it, but you don't want to stare at this all the time. And so then your object is like, okay, we'll make them invisible at runtime. But Lumen has a lot of built-in limitations, and without getting too technical, they don't work consistently if they're invisible emissive objects. So I talked to Oliver and I said, here's what I kind of want to do. And so he basically did kind of some deep research on Lumen and said, what if I make a group of primitives that kind of basically work at the resolution that Lumen works at? And instead of using, you know, but under the hood, it's effectively just injecting light into the Lumen system directly. And And so we made our own custom primitives that do that. Now there is a cost of Lumen, but once you're paying for it, you basically, which we definitely want to use Lumen, it makes a huge difference. You basically can add any number of these lights at nearly free, we'll say. I mean, there is eventually some, as with everything, if you put 5,000 of these in a scene, you're going to run into some problems. But you can see like this is effectively, and we have different types. We'll get back to the card type here. This is doing a very similar thing to what I was showing you. But we have like these cards, and we have two-sided cards. We have boxes, that emit up from all those different faces, and you can scale them and change their color and so on. So that's kind of the foundation for a lot of the lighting look. And there are some limitations of this approach, one of which is that it's very soft, but because I was going after a painterly stage feel, I didn't want a lot of hard, crisp shadows everywhere. So it actually helped us to have that sort of lower res feel to it. And you do get shadows off them, but if I were to play from here, which I could try doing, you'll see that the shadows that it generates are pretty soft and just more like, looks a little bit more like occlusion, like something's kind of softly blocking the light. And that's nice when you're using a lot of sort of stage lighting techniques, so you don't get a lot of harsh shadows where you don't want them, because those have a way of attracting players' attention. And you can see like under the lighthouse here, if I detach, I get a little closer here, you can see, there is some subtle shadowing going on underneath there, right? If this thing didn't have shadows, it would just be as bright directly under as there, but it's very subtle and it's very soft. So that is, some of the advantage of using Lumen. Using our lights, and Lumen is the basis of that. Now, another big part of our lighting is actually volumetric fog, which is baked into Unreal. And if we go to our WV system, you can see that there's global fog in the level, if you will. So if I grab this lowlands here, and I go to our fog section, again, this is all set up so we can change it per area. You can see that, if I, well, let's just leave this fog density. Let's just increase it really high, right? So I've got a color you see that color is affecting the distance there, but not up close. And then we have a volumetric color up close. And you can kind of use these two different colors. Some are volumetric, some not. You can use a directional one scattering, which is a color just around the sun, which depends on how much it can bleed through. You can use all this to tune the overall look of the game. It has a big impact on the level. However, a lot of times when I'm going to undo some of this. A lot of times when you're in a level, you want to draw extra emphasis or attention on something. And so you need something more local than that. And so we have these little volumetric fog volumes that we created. Jeremy Mitchell first set these up for us. He's one of our VFX artists. And these volumes can be placed around, and they're in a cube form, so you can kind of scale this cube to any size and put them around. And they do have some performance impact, but they're relatively inexpensive. And these are used all over the place as well, and you can use them subtly or strongly. And because they're volumetric, they actually get affected by light sources. So the sun affects them, the lights attached to the lighthouse affect them, and you can do things like change their colors. They have a color on the top and bottom of them. They have an opacity. You can even give them an emissive if you really want them to be blown out. And they have animation, right? So these are sort of made of particles effectively. So we can set the scale of the noise. You can see if I'm changing that there. We can set how fast it moves. So if I want to change the scroll speed, we'll just make something really fast. You can kind of see that. And if you play the game, it affects everything in a volumetric way. So it's not fakery, it's real fog, or at least as close as we get to it right here. So we use these all over the place for a variety of things to add emphasis, both in exterior and interior spaces. If I play the game, one other thing that you'll notice, and actually let's go to an earlier section of the game, because it's a little more, earlier section of this level rather, it's a little more obvious here, is, now of course our game involves light because you're a lighthouse, and so the player has these sort of shadow casting light attached to the lighthouse. So you have this beam here and you have your focus beam. And these are actually real, sort of shadow casting spotlights attached to the lighthouse. But there's some subtle things that are going on with them. And so, of course, there's a gobo or a texture they're projecting on them to kind of make it look like the light is shining through the lighthouse. But the reason why that's faked is because the lighthouse's light doesn't actually occlude itself. So if you shine around to the back, you can kind of see it's going through itself there. Now we have some cool visual effects stuff on to make it look like the beams are being interrupted, but those beams are just effects. And the reason why that is because we didn't want people to like aim their light around and have shadows cast off themselves all the time, which is exactly what would happen if you could shine a light all around you like this. So we did some trickery on the effects to make the beams look interrupted, but the light itself is not affected by the player's own self. So it's kind of a little subtle thing we did there. And the other thing you'll notice is the lighthouse moves through this level. You'll see, and if I get to a dark space, you'll especially notice it. You'll see that it looks like it's being hit on the sides from lighting. You see that there's like kind of a cool light from the left and a slightly warmer light from the right. So those are lights, but they're attached to the lighthouse. They're actually not in the level at all. And they only affect the lighthouse and things attached to the lighthouse, like the bird, the nest, things like that. And so we actually have volumes that control those. So we have volumes that, and I'll sort of see if I can demonstrate it here. We have volumes that control the color of the lighthouse's beam, the color of its windows, which you see get brighter when you use your focus beam, and those sort of rim lights that are attached to the lighthouse. And that uses another volume called a property blending volume, or a PBV volume, that lets us specify how bright the light is, what color the light is, both the light that the player is aiming, as well as the lights that are on the lighthouse. And I'll show you what one of those volumes looks like. They're not too much to look at, but I can grab one. You know what I'll do is I'll grab it, and then we'll do it in real time so you can kind of see here if I play here. So it's really fascinating. And this is one of the first systems we set up because I knew that we were going to need some ability. It would be really hard to have one value of light that's always the right amount across our game because of how many different colors and lighting schemes we have. So if I search for PBV, for example, and we use them for other things, but for lighting, you can see that, let's see, if I grab this one, this will probably be the right one here. So if I look at what we got here, here's the lighthouse. So what I can check real quick just to make sure. So let's look at the emissive value. So if I change this, you'll see that the lighthouse is just emissive change. And that should affect his light too, on the lens there, as well as his lights there. So if I shine my light, you see it still get brighter. I can set colors and values. So if I want like the default beams to be stronger, I can do this. If I want those beams to be a different color, I can do that as well. And so these will blend across the entire game as you're moving around. They subtly change. Now those rim lights that are on the character here are also here. So if I boost this up, you can see that, or I can change its color as well. So all these things change over the course of the game as you move through the game. And most of the time, the player is not even aware of it at all. But it lets us make sure they're at the right color, temperature, and values for the area that you're in, but also to sort of underscore the emotion at the time. You know, if you get in kind of like, there's an area where you're in the future in this sort of time town area, and the future is really bleak. We wanted it to feel kind of oppressive to the lighthouse, so all the lighthouse's lights turn blood red. But when you switch back to more pleasant era, it's not that way. Now you can see here, we're going to go into this future area here by shining this light, and it's kind of a positive area here over where nature's kind of overtaking the land again. And you can see that like the lights here reflect that green, and they're warm. They're not at all like that weird pink I tuned. But those change for both era and location. And setting up the lights on the lighthouse to always be in rim lighting was a little tricky because basically we have a couple lights attached directly to the lighthouse, and they're always rotating based on where the camera is. So you always get a nice, pleasant lighting, and that's not only there to help tie it into the environment, it's there so to make sure the player can see the character at all times because we have a lot of dark areas in the game, but also, again, there for whatever emotional notes we want to hit at that moment. Well, that is lighting in Keeper. Hope you enjoyed seeing some of the behind the scenes on that. And now we're going to be joined by Zach Baharov, lead animator of Keeper, who's going to show us some behind the scenes magic, some wizardry on all of our characters and how we put together these expressive and responsive characters.
Hey everyone, yeah. I wanted to talk about a little bit, show you the behind the scenes of how we put together the player characters and also the birds. The first time really you take control of the lighthouse, once it has its legs formed, you're in this sort of stumble state.
Drunk walk?
We call it drunk walk,
Drunk
yeah.
walk? Someone called it drunk walk.
Yeah. It's I mean that is very much kind of the reference there, where you're trying to keep your balance, trying to get this thing to walk without falling, which I worked with our gameplay programmer Keenan on. The idea was that we wanted to give the player the feeling of this character who's kind of finding their legs for the first time, I guess.
Their land legs?
Land legs.
Instead of sea legs.
Yeah. There are quite a few animations that make up this section.
What's this cool viewer called that we're looking at, Zach?
Yeah. So this is, in previous versions of Unreal, it was called Persona. I'm not sure if that name persists, but it's sort of the previewer window for animations. And this is what we call blend space. So you can see a little graph here and it's a 2D graph of sorts, and each of these little dots represents an animation sequence. And as we move through these, you can see that they're actually these are poses in this case. They're not full animation loops or anything, but they could be. And this is sort of which way the lighthouse is leaning. And you can see as they're leaning the stick left or right or forward or back, the lighthouse is kind of reacting to that. The body leans in that direction. And if you go too far, we go to the appropriate falling animation. Here. So, and we stay kind of in this last pose here until the player does something else, provides some other input. And so the lighthouse could be lying there on the beach for as long as you like.
Did we test that? Could someone just like 8 hours of just sitting on the beach?
Yeah, and then we end the game. And it's an alternate ending. Should do that.
Great idea, yeah.
And then once you, I think, touch any control, or it might just be the stick. I can't recall what we did in the end. We played this sort of impossible animation of this lighthouse hauling itself back up. Actually, a couple of those animations, one being when you get to the edge here, so as players were playing, so there's this walk animation that is playing, and you can see it kind of as you're upright, and it's playing slower, but then as the lighthouse leans and the weight of it is pulling in a certain direction, the legs are trying to catch up, so they start going faster. So it's the same stumble walk animation as we called it, but it is playing faster. So we're increasing the rate of that. So it kind of really feels like, almost like a drunk person, really. You're leading with, I remember in animation school, they were talking about like, yeah, this is how a drunk person walks. Like you're leading with your head and like your feet are trying to catch up to that and keep you upright.
Is that what I'm doing wrong?
You should try it.
Yeah.
In everyday life.
We talked about like baby foal. I remember talking about like, it's like a baby foal, even though it's not really how a baby foal walks, but it's that idea of like a newly born animal has that kind of like awkward sort of,
Yeah, we definitely tried
a drunk baby foal.
Yeah,
that's where, like,
I think it's
if you were to take a baby foal, feed it a lot of alcohol, and watch and give it a very heavy head. Yeah, like maybe a baby giraffe. Drunk baby giraffe.
Yeah. And you can see even in the idle animation, there's like a lot of swaying, and it's taking like little mini steps, just trying to make it feel unstable. I could also show off. I forgot to pull up one other blend space here. So this is another blend space, but this is the actual walk. So these are different. There's walk forward, walk right, and backwards. So you can do the full, you can see now I'm kind of walking. So I'm walking forward and then I'm walking a little bit forward and to the right and then really fully just to the right, kind of strafing. And then, but you could go backwards here.
You're like, you know what? I don't really want an adventure. I want to go back on my perch and just look at nothing. I relate to that.
Like go back to bed. Like I just want to sleep.
I'm going to stare into the ocean for the rest of eternity. It doesn't seem so bad. I think one of the cool things about this first segment is in addition to defying your expectations about as a player, like why am I walking at the camera? This is a view I don't really have, a second person view. I think it actually also early on is like you are not going to be in control of the camera. And you know, like it's used a dramatic effect here, and then like the second sequence is kind of a side scroller sort of camera. Those are both, I think, because neither of them really look exactly like a third person presentation. That's the first things you see.
Yeah.
That's important.
Yeah, exactly. One thing we struggled with, there was, had a little bit of a challenge with, I would say, was at one point you could do really tight circles with the control stick, and we have this sort of procedural layer of steps, little mini steps being taken by the lighthouse, and it was kind of like leaving its legs behind but trying to catch up, not really playing an animation but just placing its legs kind of all over the place, and sometimes it was just too frequent, and sometimes the legs would kind of get left behind and it would be very slidey. Like,
I like the nervous twitch I had for a while, where it had like one leg where it was like just doing this.
Like, so again, working with Keenan here, our programmer, we ended up implementing just a whole bunch of turn animations. Like, I think we have even more. I think we definitely have a 180-degree turn, a 90-degree turn, but I think we have 45-degree turns, maybe 30s, maybe even 15s. I know I authored all of those, and I'm not sure what we settled on. But if you do the full circle on the stick, you're kind of constantly triggering those animations, so you can't really break the lighthouse. It always kind of feels grounded and not really as floaty as it once did. So that was pretty, I think, a satisfying solution to that.
Plus, you've got all the real-time IK going on with 4 legs, so it's placing them at the appropriate heights and stuff, and that's also challenging. There's not a lot of games that do that for the duration of a game.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so in this section, we're playing as the lighthouse again, but in a very different context. The lighthouse is made weightless by this pollen fluff that it is accumulated on its body, and so it can float and jump in an interesting way. There are a couple of things that changed here. Obviously, the walk cycle is different. I wanted it to feel floaty, so you're making contact with the ground for a very short period of time, and this animation needed to be fairly scalable in terms of speed too, because as the player gets more and more pollen, they can move a little bit faster too. So I wanted to minimize the contact with the ground to avoid sliding, but not have to reauthor this animation a whole bunch of times for the different speeds. There's a jump animation. There are various animations on Twig as she flaps her wings, and it kind of shows you as I hold down the button, she's kind of actively, let's see, on the jump up, she's really flapping her wings quickly, and then as you start floating down, she continues, but more slowly, and if you let go of the button, she pretty much stops and just glides. So the idea there is that she is trying to assist you in whatever way she can. What I wanted to show in this section was sort of this floating feeling here, and controlling the floating and just moving the controls of the analog stick around. Feels really satisfying because you have the lower body of the lighthouse lagging behind. In the beginning, when we didn't have that, it was just this rigid column. And that
it was like an actual lighthouse on a hot air balloon or something.
Right, exactly. And I mean, part of, I remember the very beginning concepts of the lighthouse. We pretty quickly arrived on the idea that the lighthouse needs to be segmented in some way.
Especially that first segment that we were looking at earlier. You can imagine if we didn't have that breakup, like just trying to get a lean wouldn't have even worked, just would have been like a metronome or something.
Yep. One of our tech artists, Adam, and also the other one, Jerry, he was our rigger as well, made really, really good use of this technology throughout the project.
I almost think of it in my non-animator brain. I almost think of it as like a fake physics way of working. And I know we use it that way a bit because when you see like people talk about putting physics in game, what you imagine is always like, like a tail or something lagging behind. But quite often physics are fraught with weird artifacts and they shimmer or clip through things. And this gives you a lot more animation control, but still has that like follow through or secondary feel of this overlap that you get from something like physics. It's really cool.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, So as the lighthouse was floating around, we quickly found out that since it's just a giant column, it felt very rigid moving it around in midair while it was floating. Control rig is this system that is part of Unreal that allows you to create, among other things, an additional rig on top of the character. They're already the skeletal mesh, basically. So you see these controls in here. So I have this little dot selected here. It almost acts as the analog stick. So as I move it around, you can see this. Imagine this is the lighthouse in midair, and I'm moving the stick around. It's sort of reacting in a reverse. The chain goes up. The joint chain goes up the column there, but actually it's moving head first.
I mean, would you say it seems like Control Rig, when we started using it, really just improved the game feel across the board because it let us tie very specific modifications to the way things felt based on player input in a way that would be much harder, right, with blend spaces.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, before that we were using these blend spaces. But if you wanted any sort of overlap, you either had to stack or layer a whole bunch of blend spaces that are blending at different times, and even that didn't give you enough control. Whereas having direct access to the real-time data and the input of the player,
it feels much more dynamic and alive,
much more dynamic. So this was another use of Control Rig is twig interactions for some time did not feel great, and we were using blend spaces to control them. But they felt very pose to pose, kind of what I just explained with the lighthouse, because you are moving between set poses or set animations.
It's a very analog player action to slide or wind.
Yeah. So we had kind of a push. I think actually our first implementation of Control Rig was to get twig feeling better on some of these objects that she interacts with. And Control Rig allowed us to basically map player input or the stick input to something like the chest of the bird. And then everything else on the bird's body could react to that. And so the winder too had to sort of feel like it was reacting to the bird. The first implementation, everything was moving together, and it just felt like you were
like stuck to it like a hood ornament. Yeah.
You're rotating this you're winding this winder or crank, and the bird just happened to be there flapping its wings attached to it. It did not feel at all like the bird was initiating that motion. And with Control Rig, and you can see here as I'm moving the stick around, you can see all these controls moving back and forth, but it's all coming from the chest, and it feels like the wings are initiating the motion, and then it gets translated to the pelvis, and then the tail, and the head, and then the feet and the crank from there. So it really felt like the bird was and the player was making this change, and it was affecting the world. So it felt much more satisfying on a bunch of these twig animations.
Yeah, huge difference. Huge difference when we implemented that. I was like, oh, that's how it's supposed to feel. Yeah, it took a while to get there, but so good.
Yeah, and they're simple interactions, but they just feel really good to control, I think, and that was the biggest win.
That's kind of generally what we wanted is like none of the puzzles were supposed to be too difficult, but they were supposed to be in world, and a big part of that is like feeling like it's a joy to control these characters, and they're really strange characters, so we don't have, 20 years of biped experience. So we're like, well, how do we make a bird feel satisfying to slide a thing on the wall? And I think you guys really did a great job with this. It really helped.
Yeah, I think it was successful. I think we can talk about the boat. Let's hit that.
Spoilers, you're a boat.
How did that happen?
Yeah, I don't know. It's like we thought, what if we just laid the lighthouse sideways and put it in water? Could we make a game?
Yeah, we wanted to save on some.
That's right, no legs.
Yeah.
Those legs are a pain.
So in the second act, you become a boat, and we wanted the boat to feel as alive and as much of an, I guess,
fish-like
character. Yeah, we wanted that motion in there because I remember the first iterations of the boat. We talked about the fish motion pretty early, I think, even while looking at the design and talking through that. But There was, I remember at one point, the boat swimming. We had that working, and it was quite rigid, and it was just sort of...
Like the whole body would kind of just rotate, right?
Yeah, that was one aspect of it, and another was you just press the stick and it would just start going. And I think it took a little bit of tweaking and just getting a lot of little motions in there to make it feel like one thing I remember adding, and suddenly it felt much better, was every time you press the stick,
the little tail.
yeah, you get the little like faster animation of the tail just starting kicking and kind of starting that motion off. And even if you slow down in some of this kind of kelp here, when you get out of it, it kind of restarts that, and it does that little kick, like as if a fish would, if it was stuck and suddenly it can move freely.
If it was a giant lighthouse fish.
Yeah. It's a pretty natural thing.
Got to base it on something real, though, right? That's what we do.
Exactly.
Make it believable.
Yeah, totally. And you can see here, I'm showing this side-by-side view. So, and again, it was important for us to have the boat be segmented and not this one rigid, plank. I think it was pretty successful in the end. It again feels very fluid and responsive to the player's input, and which was, I think, a big goal for this character.
Yeah, we really wanted to like step that pace up, and it's funny because I remember when we looked at a lot of reference games that had boats, and we were like, well, actually, it's not really a boat. Like we call it a boat,
right,
but we didn't really want it to move like a boat because the boat just had like so much inertia, and you couldn't really control it, and it was kind of bobbing a lot, and it just didn't feel like you wanted like a fish or a shark or something. But yeah, trying to get it like more responsive and fluid as the character changes over the course of the game, so you feel like you feel the change. You don't just like see the change, right? And this is a huge part of it.
Yeah, and you can see actually it has those fins in there that are always, even if you're doing the focused light strafing back and forth, there's a blend space for that, so it can kind of like, if you're moving backwards, it like kicks them forward. If you're moving left or right, it reacts appropriately with the fins as well, and with the rudder or tail. So yeah, it's kind of, we tried to make it as alive as possible, or feel that way anyway, right, for an inanimate object, which was a lot of that type of work on this game, I think.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Zach, for coming and showing some of these awesome characters, and not only the technology behind it, but it's clear to see like all the personality you and your team put into every character. And I know that like people out playing the game in the wild have said how much joy they have just finding the little critters on the side and playing with them. And hopefully this gives everyone just a little sneak peek about the tremendous amount of work it takes to make these things feel reactive. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Next up, we're gonna talk to Will, and Will is gonna show us a little bit on the environment side, some of the sculpting techniques that they put together to make our world feel strangely also kind of organic and alive.
Hey, I'm Will. I am a senior environment artist here at Double Fine, and I worked on Keeper. So I'm here to talk about maybe some of the more technical aspects of the art pipeline. So I'm in one of my favorite scenes here. This is the Hall of Elders, actually maybe an area right before the Hall of Elders, as we called it. This has a lot of like great examples of the art pipeline, like almost every aspect of it. So one of the first things I like to talk about that is unique about Keeper is that just about everything has no textures, at least not in the traditional sense that most games have, like 0 to 1 mapped, like base color, normal, and then like a packed map with your roughness and ambient occlusion, maybe a metalness in there. For this game, we really wanted everything to sort of like blend together and have like full control over the look of every asset, every instance of the asset, right? And we also wanted to empower a very small team of environment artists to do a lot more, get a lot more reuse out of our textures and assets, because we don't have a lot of people here at Double Fine, so we kind of have to make do and make tools that empower our few. So I can show you a little example of that here. We have a bunch of wall assets. Oop, I'm clicking on the vines. We have a bunch of wall assets like these. And I'm clicking on the volumes accidentally, but here we go. And they can all have the same texture, and they can all be mapped in world space so that they kind of like blend together very well. This isn't like a great example, actually. Look over here. There we go. So you can see here we have a wall, seemingly, and this is actually kit bashed together with tons of like rocks and entrance and trees and whatnot, and these are all from like earlier parts in the level. But they all kind of like merge together because they are using this system where instead of all those traditional maps, we generated a ton of masks. So we masked like edges, cavities, there's like a top to bottom mask. There's like all sorts of great stuff to help us like control the look of the assets. And this is a whole pipeline that Nick Maxim actually put together. He's the lead environment artist. So if I select some of these, you can see the outlines of the separate assets. And then over here we have just tons and tons of controls for like every layer. And then we have a whole library of materials that we can just swap in and out. So even though this model has this texture right now, in other levels it'll have different textures, and that's kind of how we get more reuse out of that. So this is actually a rock that I sculpted like maybe in the first couple months on the project, and it got used throughout the entire game, just at different material sets, different contexts. So you can see the system at work a little better if I'm going to turn off snapping here. As I move it, you can see those textures are swimming around. They're changing because the context is changing. New surfaces are now pointed up, so moss is going to take over there. The whole surface itself is moving, so the texture also has to move so that it is consistent between, say, this rock and this rock. And you can see there's an entrance here. There's also a tiny bit of normal information in the tiling textures. So that's giving just a little bit of bite to these otherwise smooth surfaces. It makes it look, so like each of these tiny strokes also has a little bit of normal information. Not too much, it gets too noisy if you let it like dictate entirely. But having just that little bit actually made a really big difference. Yeah, I really like this wall. And another thing you can see on this wall is these paint strokes. So just about every inch of the game is covered in these paint strokes. They're kind of hard to miss. Although we did try to make them as subtle as possible, and they are really directed to the camera. So the process of this usually started with playing the game, and then every couple of feet that the camera moved, you jumped out of play mode and back into edit mode, and then you grabbed this foliage tool, and let's say my camera was like, you know, here, or I think it's actually way closer. This scene was a pain in the ass because the camera got really close to the models like this. But you'd get in there and make all these little strokes. So for example, if I just delete these, you can see there's lots of sort of sculpted information and some of the tileable information, and it's not like all necessary for what we want, especially, you know, stuff that's on the border or in a place that you don't want the player to focus a lot. So for example, stuff that's on the border of the scene, like this element, we might want to de-emphasize a lot of the details here, these like realistic kind of sculpted details. So I'm just going in here and maybe simplifying what's already there. This involves a lot of undoing, but and sometimes I'm like getting these little pops of color like this moss and grabbing that and sort of dragging it out to be a little more stylized. Yeah.
So these paintbrushes are sampling the color of the thing you're placing them on automatically?
Yeah, so I think Oliver set this up, and yeah, it from what I can tell, it samples the start and end of your stroke, and then blends between them. It samples the color, the normal direction, probably a couple other things. It's just, it was a huge effort to get this working, but it was something that felt kind of like a pillar of our art style, so it felt worth doing. And it helps kind of make it stand out visually as a game. Not a lot of games will go for this sort of thing because it is a lot of work. It also is like a matter of taste, you know. So it is kind of hard to also teach and onboard other artists to do this because there's a lot to it that you just sort of build up over time, where you realize what looks good and what doesn't. This is one of my favorites here. This tree. So you can see we have a couple like bent strokes here. And I'm sort of like going outside the bounds and making these like stylistic choices, like these rake strokes here that are kind of blue-green. This one that's breaking the silhouette. Again, this little rake down here, I'm just trying to like kind of accentuate the form and almost give it like, it's got like little waves coming off of it, you know. Sometimes I'm like adding detail a little bit. Like these, if I can get close, like these little bits of moss, grass, and then I'll throw in like a accent color, like these little pinks. That's usually, you know, sampled somewhere from like these flowers or something, just so it's all cohesive. So a good way to illustrate sort of the effect that this gives is to turn it off, you know. So this is the scene as it is when all we've done is just place like the meshes and maybe tune the materials. But then after the brush strokes, it looks like this. You can see off, on. So it goes a long way to make it like look kind of like concept art. Obviously, it's like almost impossible to make an actual 3D game look like concept art, but we did our darndest. And I think we were pretty successful at that, you know.
You said you go through with the camera gameplay, because all this has to be sort of camera facing.
Yeah, so that was like a huge concern. It was sort of the reason I would always recommend only working from the camera angles is because it's really easy to go around and just put strokes down. But then if you go and play and see it from the camera, like seeing these strokes off angle, seeing them on their side gives a really bad feel, you know? You're basically like looking at a piece of paper that's like almost disappearing, you know? And that's not very painterly, you know? That is like a very CG looking thing. So that was like a big part of this process was you would do a pass and then someone else would play it and look at it and then like point out which strokes and then go back through and like fix individual strokes so that you're just avoiding any situation like that. Yeah, let's talk about sculpting. So I would say there was like two pretty unique things that we did for Keeper in terms of like sculpting, modeling, and that is the first one is VR. I used VR a lot. Nick used VR a lot. We had, as you can see, especially later in the game, like a lot of like organic, weird, warpy sculpts. In like a normal sculpting program, this can be pretty tricky, or it would take you like a really long time. In VR, doing like gestural organic shapes just with your hands and like simple clay brushes that work on like booleans instead of just pushing a surface around. It was actually like pretty quick and pretty fun to do. So this is one of my favorite assets because it is sort of a combination of the VR sculpting and the fractal math that we tried to incorporate into the game. So early on, we talked about fractals quite a lot, and we always struggled with how to like incorporate them. And ultimately, what we kind of decided on was mostly incorporating them into the VFX via alphas that I generated in Substance Designer. So in Substance Designer, I made a fractal generator that had all these like sliders so that you could make, whatever you want. So that was really cool. But then we also use those to sculpt quite a bit. So this guy here is actually a 3D fractal that I started with in Blender, and then I took over to the VR sculpting program to like make it all wrinkly, give it a lot of these like extra holes that are in between all these like finger-like appendages coming off of it. And you can see it's got that repeated pattern of like, this kind of looks like a hand, and then on each finger is another hand. And then down here, they sort of start to morph into like just the knuckles are kind of sticking out. And then that whole hand thing is like gripping this ball with eyes kind of sticking out of it. Yeah. So that's why that's one of my favorites. What else we got? Oh yeah, this is the skate park that's made out of like meaty cellular goodness. So that was another thing we kind of wanted to, we didn't want things to look like a pile of organs, or at least not too much like it. Because this isn't like a gross out game. It's not a horror game. You're not like supposed to be creeped out really at any point. So we went for more of this like cellular look. And that's a very specific look. And we reference just tons of like micro photography and stuff like that to find like organelle shapes like these, just to like work into the sculpts and give it that cell look. Where's the delete on this thing? There we go. Oh, I forgot about the delete thing. Okay, we're free again. There's these great webs everywhere. I think Nick made these, and then Dan in VFX made them like snap when you roll through them. I hope I got that right, who worked on those, but yeah. Yeah, and I made these bowls here, and you can see it's got almost cell-like impressions just all over it. And in VR, this was actually like pretty easy to do. I just had a little round brush, and I just sat there and just scraped away at the side of the bowl in physical space, just turning the bowl, poking at it over and over again, and then coming back through with a smaller brush and poking those holes with more holes like this. And I mean, it gave me a sore neck, but I think the effect is worth it. And so like those, like doing all that sculpting and having it work with our texture system made it easy to like bash things together and make these like murals of flesh that just have a great effect.
What about making these tunnels? Like, is that, do they kit bash from a lot of different segments?
Yeah, these tunnels were also really fun. Pretty much the same process. Like I just made a tube, just a hunk of clay with a hole in it. And then I just sat there in virtual reality inside this tube and scraped away at the walls. And then after I, made all these scallops like this, and I gave it sort of a spiral flow. After I did that, I went back with a smaller brush and poked all these little holes because I knew these pulsating cell guys are going to be in there. And then cut a little path like this, because you should always reinforce the path. It's half the job of the environment artist. Overall, like Keeper's just had such a unique process, and it allowed us to do so much more than I thought we would from the outset. And yeah, I think it was really worth it to put in the time and effort up front to set up our own custom pipeline tools to enable all that, instead of just like settling for what Unreal like already had, packaged in, Yeah, You know, I think these shapes were like proxy meshes that I made. You never get close to these, so you can never really quite look at them. But they're these like almost like molted shells of tentacles. um, yeah, I just thought that was a cool shape, and so I put it in the game because that was our process for the game, which is great. It's great to have the freedom to have just an idea and to just put it in. If it looks cool, like, yeah, why not, you know?
Hey, I'm Asif Siddiky. I was one of the level designers on Keeper, and today I was just going to show you an area where the gameplay and camera systems really came together to complement each other. You know, most of the game is a pretty linear experience, and you sort of move from one end of the room to the other, and there's not a lot of backtracking and not a lot of puzzle solving, but this is one area where we really concentrated those things in one space and had you sort of retraversing an area back and forth several times. And so there were a lot of unique camera challenges that came with that, and signaling to the player in a game that has no dialogue or UI text of any kind. So let's talk about how we did that. So coming into this space, this is just another pretty straightforward area where you're going through and arriving at the next puzzle zone. But this is where we start pulling a couple of different levers to help the player out. You can see here that as I'm approaching this gate, you know, the camera's only going to follow you so far, and that sort of implies that, you know, there's no progressing beyond this point. You've got to do something here, aside from the door ahead of you. But if I come back here and send Twig out to start interacting with things in the world, you can see that the camera has moved beyond the lighthouse, and it's just Twig on screen. So that was sort of our subtle way of saying that this is just a Twig-only interaction. You don't need to worry about the lighthouse's position, and you just worry about what Twig is doing. But then, if you send Twig over to one of these side winders, you can see that we've moved the lighthouse over into a specific spot, and we're keeping it in frame so that you can aim your light around. And now you can see that without your light trained on this thing, Twig is not going to want to stay on the winder. So we give you sort of a gentle reminder there of like, okay, the lighthouse is relevant here. Keep the light trained on this, and now you can actually progress through the puzzle. And then a similar thing over here on this side. And you can see that all of these camera angles are complementing as best as possible the actual like thing that you're affecting in the world. So we tried to keep that spinning element there sort of centered and adhering to the rule of thirds. Okay, so now another thing that was really interesting that isn't often apparent to the player, but it makes a difference just subconsciously, is that there are all these events that happen in the game, and under the hood, we are telling different cameras to turn on and off based off of your progress. So in this case, you can see that the gate has opened here. And now if I were to walk away from this gate and then come back to it, you would see that the camera is no longer hanging behind you. It's now smoothly following along and continuing to move with you into this space. And if I were to go back, you can see that the gate is still open. This is a very dumb little thing that I really wanted to get in just for fun, but there is a point past which, you know, we want to block the player in and prevent them from going backwards, just because it's a way of, you know, saying you don't need to go back there anymore. The gameplay that we care about is ahead of you now. So we've closed that gate behind you, and if you happen to come back again, you get this little keyhole shot that's, you know, maybe, I don't know, 0.5% of people will probably see, but it's just a fun perspective on the character, and you can see some of these little townsfolk milling around, and you get a nice little shot of the mountain there. So, you know, there's varying degrees of significance for when and, you know, where we turn different cameras off, and there's a ton of that throughout this space. So I'll show you a few more examples as we move through. I'm going to go ahead and skip the cutscenes just to focus on gameplay stuff. So this was actually a space that was really challenging because, you know, oftentimes we don't have much stuff that's directly in front of the camera and also blocking the player. But this is one space where we do allow you to walk all the way around this really tall object that changes state over the course of this level. So as you solve more and more of this puzzle, you know, this thing stands up taller and gets in your way. So we really had to, and I can show you this later afterwards, but there's like an insane spider web of cameras and volumes here that are all making this as smooth as possible as you go from one side of the sort of town square area to the other. And you can see here, like I probably hugged this back edge here 1,000 times, just making sure that the camera never actually clips through this thing. You know, again, like in a game where you have no real guidance and no characters reminding you what to do, like how do we signal what's important here? You know, we have a couple of different roads you can take here, and you as the player have no real context for what lies ahead. You know what I mean? Like it's very easy during development to just assume that like, oh yeah, people will remember this temple is over here, this temple is over there, but it's very easy for these things to get lost in the mix. So, you know, there's obvious things like signage pointing towards different areas with different symbols on them that correspond with the symbols that you see on this character here. But in addition to that, there are subtle little things that happen with the camera as well. So we assign these things that we call look-at targets, and they're basically little targets that exist in space, and whenever you are within a certain proximity or within a certain trigger, we will start to weigh those objects, those target points, a little bit more. So you can see that as I sort of like move around this space, it's kind of keeping this winder in frame here, so that you know it's an object of significance, and we can send Twig to that, and move the lighthouse into frame, and set things up in such a way where you can see the exact effect of what that winder is doing. And then, you know, always keeping signs like these just in frame so that we continue to reinforce that there's something important in this direction. And as you come over here, you know, same sort of deal, like this is another thing that has a weight to it as like a point of interaction. So if I were to interact with this, the world is going to change here. A little bit of a hitch. I don't think I can skip this part. Yeah. And it's tough too. I mean, like, you know, it's never going to be perfect. I mean, at a certain point we have to like stop working on the game. So some of these transitions are going to be a little bit more aggressive than others. But I think for the most part, if like you play through it pretty naturally and don't try to sprint through everything, you know, the camera is going to gradually settle into a position that helps set you up and give you all the information that you need for solving this next step of the puzzle. So here you can see that we've just got these two prominent things that you need to interact with. And from what I've seen, it's been actually pretty validating to watch streamers play through this game and to watch them slowly figure this thing out. It's like, okay, I've sent Twig to the winder, as I've done several times now, but nothing's happening. And you know, there's like a couple of seconds of confusion and people not knowing what to do. And then they're like, oh, wait, there's this other really prominent thing here. Let me try interacting with that and see what happens. And then you can see immediately that like Twig is returned to its physical form and can wind again. And that's about as much, you know, head scratching as we wanted the player to do in this area. It's not really about like creating a frustrating experience for the player. We wanted them to have like these little character moments where like something, you know, major happens to Twig that is unexpected and fits within this sort of strange world we've created. And then allow a cool moment of realization like that to happen, so then players can move on and keep solving the next thing and see the next space and find out a little bit more about the world. One thing let me highlight something else in another direction, because I think there's some better examples of how we changed the camera setup based off of the different era that you're in. That's what we called these past, future, and present tenses. So you can see here that there's this little overpass bridge here that you can walk up, right? And, you know, the camera's following you pretty smoothly all the way up through here. But if I were to go back and enter a different era, I'll interact with this switch here. So we're going to see the world change around us a little bit. You know, and it's hard to know like exactly what the impact is of this change is everywhere in the level. Like we show you the most important stuff in the cutscene, so you definitely don't miss that. You know, we want to see that building come back together and twig changing into a form that, you know, renders it unusable. So that part makes sense for the stuff immediately ahead of you. But if you were to go back in this direction now and try to take this path, you'll see that it's under construction here in the past. And we wanted to make it very clear that, like, you know, the camera isn't going to continue following you up here. And I'll show you something from the other side of that as well to account for all the different states. This is something that I added in just at the end when we were like getting down to like the last like week or two of camera polish that I was really glad that I got in. You know, these eras affect which of these temples you can access at a given time. And you can see here as I approach this seal on the ground, as you get closer and closer to this, the camera starts to look up and it slowly starts to lift up and give you this sort of like grander view of the two spaces, you know, and again, those look at targets are softly like pointing towards the temple on the right, like the thing's all lit up, and you can see that the bridge is whole over there. And if I were to switch eras, you can see now that suddenly the camera's going to shift over towards the left a little bit and frame this constructed bridge a little bit better. So really, it's just a bunch of things like that across the game, but in this space especially. Let me head back here and show you what would happen if you had, you know, approached this from the sort of less than ideal angle. So now you can see, like, you're trying to backtrack. You decided not to go to that temple, but you know, if we had just stuck with the previous camera, you would not have seen this switch, and that was actually the case for a while. Like, players were sort of left wondering, well, what am I supposed to do here? And, you know, the view used to look maybe a little bit something closer to this before. And so it was really hard to sort of like aim at this thing off camera. But we added these settings that allowed you to have different camera values based off of whether you're traveling forwards or backwards. And in this case, when you're traveling backwards in this direction, the camera pulls out significantly as you approach this end of it. And then if you get right up against this wall here, or this barrier, we actually blend to a different camera that features this little time switch nicely. So you're able to aim at it more easily, and then you'll see as the era switches, that camera goes away, and now we're using the sort of default camera for this zone. So coming back up here, let's say I wanted to go up in this direction now. And so we come up around here, camera's following you nice and smoothly. Everything's cool for getting here. And if I decide to go in this direction towards this temple, there's a special volume here that only exists in this era that like cuts to this hard angle of like, okay, you definitely cannot progress this way. So that's like a good sign to just turn around and find something else to do. There's got to be some other thing you can do to restore that bridge. You can see here again as you approach this door, in addition to that glint on the winder, the camera's also sort of like pulling in a little bit and coming up. And now while you're interacting, we get into this place where you can see both of these gates opening at the same time in concert, so that when that's totally open, you can come down here. This is another little spot where if you happen to go off on this side path, you know, you could get a sense of what the road looked like towards each of these temples. You can see that this is totally blocked off here still, so there's something you need to do. And, you know, we wanted to keep that little time switch framed for as long as possible so that when we cut to this angle, you know that you need to come over here and switch that. And then I'll show you something else as we backtrack a little bit. See, these are all the things you have to account for when someone gets lost in an area and they don't know quite what to do next. You know, if a person did that, it's like, well, what you're supposed to do is go across here, right? And you can see here that we're cutting to an angle now that shows the the bridge is fully restored and no longer blocked. But if you decide not to go in that direction for whatever reason and come back this way and try to go back towards the town center, then what you'll find is this unique camera angle that only exists in this era, right? And it's, again, one of those things that allows you to sort of take in what's blocking your path and preventing you from moving back the way you want to go, but then also allowing you to switch eras so that this path can be restored. And then there's also this signage here that is pointing back towards the temple. So we're using basically as many different levers as we can, both with the camera and the framing and the environment art and just all these little visual effects that are drawing your eye towards the most important things to help the player along and sort of get a sense of where they are in the world. Oh, okay, great. I do have the debug stuff. Awesome. This is, something we had to use a lot throughout just to test all these different eras here. So if I were to set this to the past, it automatically enables all of those different camera triggers I was talking about as well. So it was really valuable to start pairing those things together as early as possible so that, whenever you changed eras, we were affecting all the things in the world that we wanted to. All right, so let's come through here a little bit. I think this temple has some pretty good examples of how the camera changes in subtle ways as you progress through the different puzzles just to help the player along. So you can see here that, as I go up these steps, we're really featuring that symbol up there to sort of reinforce that this is the era that we're in and the era that this temple belongs to. And if we open the door, come through here, and you can see that the camera's really not doing too much as you look off towards the sides here. Not much to do here, but if you start going down this way, then the camera hangs behind. And it sort of creates this sense of like, okay, something significant is about to happen if you keep going through this doorway. And now we've got this door closed and you can no longer access that hall camera. Okay, so this is an area that I remember fixing towards the end of production where players were talking about a lack of clarity. It's really tough in an area where you have all these tight little passages to sort of show all the different ways that you could go. So we wanted to make sure that the camera was always pulled back generously. And, even at the start of this room here, you can see the light from the other room just sort of on the edge of the frame. So that's guiding your eye forward and showing you all the options. There's a spot here to retrieve twig. And I always like this little camera move. This is an old film school favorite that I feel like I saw in every student project where the camera would just move through the wall seemingly as you walked from one room to the next. So I had to throw that in there, of course. Again, this is a thing where like you've got a tight space. There's a lot of visual information here. How do we choose what to focus on? So you've got this cool environment, this big, warm, interactive thing here. So that's where we're putting our focus. And one of my favorite things with this, because this has a couple of different moving pieces, is that you'll see when you send twig over to these mechanisms, the camera's just very slightly tilting down in conjunction with that and then popping back up as this thing now moves into place. And so same sort of thing here. You can see if I change eras, and I'm not doing anything on the camera. Things are slowly settling back down and our focus is drifting over to the door on the right there. And see, that's again without me doing anything. So these are all the little things that we do across the game to, subtly signal that like this interaction is over and this is where you need to head to next. Again, like the camera's only going to do so much here. Pretty tight space. There's so many spots where like where we're backing the camera into like an extreme corner. And, this is all, hindsight being 2020. It's like, if we could go back, I would create these little channels or like shelves basically in all of these rooms where the camera could sit comfortably and the lighthouse could sort of brush up against it without creating some awkward clipping. But, you know, I think we reacted to the spaces as best as we could. So again, you know, keeping that blockage on screen so that when you changed eras, it was immediately apparent what had changed. And now you can move forward. This is another tricky room because, you know, with all these spaces, you kind of want to limit the cutting from one room to another as much as you can, just because having a continuous camera always helps keep the player oriented with where they're going and what they're doing. But anytime you do this, you have to obey, you know, the law of, or the line of action. So the camera sort of has to be on this same side. So as you're moving towards the front or towards the left, you continue moving in that direction beyond the cut. And, you know, we've got stuff on the far side of the room here that needs focusing on. We've got stuff on this side of the room. So, you know, there's always this sort of like back and forth between like, well, how do we keep all the relevant elements in frame here? So this is the thing that I'm most focused on right now. So I can send twig there, and then, you know, not much else is happening. If I stick to this side of the room, you can see that, you know, the camera's only letting me get so far, and the collision as well. So coming back over here, you can sort of get the full picture again. So now I interact with this. Immediately you can see the changes across the room. We have this bit of wither here blocking that gear, and twig is an egg again. So you can come over to this space. And there'll be another thing that happens here as the puzzle is solved, where this should relax a little bit. I think it depends on where you are in the space, really. But if I had been standing in the room, you might have seen the view center a little bit more. And that's really hard, too. I mean, that's another challenge, is like, how do you know where a player is going to be when they solve a certain puzzle? Like, in a game where you can send twig from, like, a variety of spaces, like, you know, you're never going to guarantee that the player is always in the perfect spot. So you kind of just have to, like, pick the center and think about what the ideal is, and then, you know, try to just make it work from as many places as possible. And hopefully, you know, most players will sort of like keep themselves in the center of the room and interact with everything. But, you know, that's really hard to control for. All right, so coming in this direction, you know, making sure that we don't lose sight of twig when we're in this area and in this era, so that you know to get it back. Quickly move through this space, and we'll grab this little effigy here. And then coming through to open this door back towards the entrance. And then I'll show one thing real quick, just to demonstrate some of the camera changes for the post-complete state of this temple. You can see now that, like, we have a much broader view of the entrance. We're slightly pulled back a little bit. You know, we can see that all the characters are gone. This thing is completely, you know, sort of like morphed over. I don't know. I didn't want to say scabbed because that sounds gross, but you know, there's just no going back here, right? There's no more shimmer here. You are done with this space. And as we walk down the stairs, we're no longer, you know, weighting this symbol on the top here like we were when, you know, there was still stuff to do inside this space. And as you move over here, we are now actually turning the camera in a totally different direction, again, so that you can see this time switch and see that the bridge is restored. And if I were to go back here, you would see too that, you know, even though I'm in this era, we're not quite giving the same weight to this thing anymore, right? We still are looking at the player from this sort of like far away camera on the side, rather than being directly behind you the way we were prior to completing that temple. So I'm gonna skip ahead and show one more thing that I was just proud of from like a, you know, camera authoring point of view and laying out a space. And that is, here, let's just for completion's sake, let's just show this real quick and see what changes as we plug this thing in. So we're going to pack that in. And you can see now that the head is lifted up a little bit, and so you have to make sure that, again, the camera's not clipping through it when we do that. But when you finish everything and you get all of these things plugged in, we can go to the synchronized time setting. And now everyone's celebrating. This is all good, and we have a totally different camera that actually follows you up here. But if I had come here prior to resolving this town and synchronizing time, the camera would have lifted up significantly and pointed towards the bramble blocking all this gate here. So we've completed this town area, and we're moving beyond, and the camera completely switches. And now we're just sort of on this pleasant little journey here where we see all this life coming back down the mountain, and some little characters are starting to emerge. And you can see these little characters are sort of coming out to investigate who you are and what you're doing. And these little flowers are a little nervous, so they just sort of sprout and root whenever you get too close to them. But what I liked about this space is that it is pretty much an unbroken camera for this whole ascent. And we've got all these switchbacks, which we don't do very often, and all these things passing by in the foreground. And as we get up here, there are all these opportunities to come off to the side and see things happening in sort of the deep background. I really like that there's a reward for hanging out in a spot long enough. You can see that if I stay here, there's actually a procession of these characters silhouetted in the background here. And if you were to wait long enough, you can watch them make their little journey down the mountainside. And, having things like this, I feel like just kind of reinforces the mood of the game that we were going for. Where we want to invite you to stop and just sort of take in an area. And if you do that, then you get to see these tiny little story things play out. It's nothing major or narrative altering for the entire game, but it just makes the world feel a little bit more lived in, and there is stuff happening outside of your control that has its own motivations and interests and its own places to go. So coming around here again, it's just how many different angles could we find to show this sort of snaking behavior as you're making your way up. You can see some of these little characters running around in the foreground. And then again, the camera starts following the player as we come around here and start to get these big drop-off views towards the side, while still keeping you focused towards the front. Again, camera hanging back when you're about to have some sort of significant reveal. And it's wow, I've come up to this much higher area now, where the air is a little bit clearer, and there's even more life up here. There's still a little secret or two for the player to enjoy and briefly take a detour with. So this is just one tiny little space where you can collect a little achievement by regrowing this glyph here, which is what we were calling them. And this is going to be a shader issue, but you can see this thing reconstructing here, and the camera is sort of tilting up as this thing grows into place. And then coming back. So continuing forward this way. Get all these little moments again. So we know that when you pass this little root area, if you keep going, you're going to see all of these flowers sort of appear out of the mountainside and settle in here. And then that leads your eye down to this waterfall, and that waterfall leads your eye down to that little pool there where those characters are taking these little dives. So it's all about thinking about the path that the player is going to take and what's going to be revealed as you're walking along at like a normal speed, and like what things can we show you in those spots just to keep things interesting as you're moving along. And then leading your eye over here, it's like, you know, naturally whenever you get to the top of something, you want to sort of like look back and see where you came from. I feel like this is something that is so true for hiking in general. I know that was cited as one of Lee's inspirations, so really took that to heart when setting up a space like this, and we wanted to make sure that this was satisfying. And, you know, it's also one of those things where like early on when this space is being laid out, you know, we knew that we wanted to eventually arrive at this moment. So even while I was working on the cameras all the way down at the bottom and positioning this thing that you're standing on and the town, this camera was already set up like from the get-go, basically. It's because we knew we eventually wanted to like see this much of the town and this much of the seaside when we got up here. So I was always keeping those two things in mind whenever we were building the space in between. You know, we have this handy feature where you can select a camera and then it shows a little picture-in-picture preview in the corner of the screen, and you can lock that into place. So even while you're working, you can see that angle. And so you can sort of position things along the way that maintain this framing, both from up here and when you're down at the bottom. And I can show that when we exit out of gameplay as well. All right, so coming out of here, this last little area, where again, you'll see that like the camera is sort of continuing to focus on what Twig is doing in the foreground. Let's see if we can get one of those without the shader popping. Okay, so this is another example of where you are focusing on something that Twig is doing, and we sort of, you know, your natural tendency is to sort of keep walking, but the camera's still focusing on this thing. So you come back and you watch what Twig is doing, and then when it returns to you, you can you feel comfortable moving on. Same sort of thing here. You can see that the camera's still kind of hanging on what Twig's doing in the foreground. And now camera's kind of like slowly, even before that glint appeared, you could see that there was like a soft little look up, right, towards that nest, just to start drawing your eye towards it before it became interactive. And then we have this whole cutscene where the branch breaks and the nest falls down. And now the camera is totally different because we want to have like a nice view of this egg that we just revealed, and we want to see Twig taking care of it and being in the nest. If I were to come back, you can see that there's a slightly different camera setup here as well that just makes this whole thing seamless. So it's just, you know, a bunch of little things like that over and over again that account for all the different styles of play, even in a really linear space. That I just feel like we did as good of a job as we could, honestly, like helping the player focus on what they should be focusing on, absent of everything else, right?
You talked about the mess of camera boxes down around the
Yeah. So let's jump over here. And so you can see that, you know, let's get a bird's eye view of this space here, which, you know, this is also something that the player never sees, right? And it's really easy, I think, when you're working with this kind of view while you're working on the game to just assume that like, oh, well, I know where everything is because I see the level like this all the time. You can't just assume that the player is going to have that same mental map of the space. And, you know, we had briefly thought of like having a spot early on where like, you know, when you arrived in the town, maybe you had a view like this, right? And the camera would track you around, but there were so many different ways that we had already kind of like settled on that you could go in and out of this space, that quickly transitioning to a closer camera or even cutting to it would be really aggressive just because of how the player could move around, especially if you were dashing from one side of the space to the other. So we decided not to have something like this and, you know, opted for something which was a lot more challenging, which was step by step, trying to like keep you focused on where you were headed. Okay, so if you look at this space, seems simple enough, but if I unhide everything, you can see that there's this just insane tangle of cameras. And yeah, this is sort of like, it's very easy to, I don't know, if you don't know how all this stuff is set up, then you'll be totally lost, I feel like. There's almost no good way to really organize it, but I tried my best to sort of keep all the naming consistent as possible, and note when things belong to certain eras and when certain camera volumes were acting in concert together, because we had, all of our camera volumes either fall into like a capsule, sphere, or box shape. And for all these spaces where you have all these strange configurations, you have to kind of pair them together to cover a certain stretch of ground with the same camera. Even just coming into this space here, it was necessary to have all these different branches sort of on top of each other, so that the transition between these as you went from one side of the square to the other was never too severe, right? And all of these cameras have some degree of what we called fin width to them. And the fin was basically a way for the camera to move off the rail a certain amount of distance, right? So if I was to like select one of these, let's pick this one. You can see these lines here on the side that are showing sort of where the camera sort of stays really close to the rail, and as you get out into these more open areas, it's getting a little bit wider. So if I were to then keep this rail selected, and we had a preview function, which I'm not sure is going to be set up on this computer. You're not going to see the lighthouse, but on my computer, and it's a local setting, but you could hold down a key, and I think right now it's just showing you like a sort of like a default little like mesh here. But for me, it was the lighthouse, right? And so you can see there in the corner, I get this little preview window of what the camera is actually going to be doing as I move the lighthouse around the space. So that was kind of a rough idea. And a lot of my work on this game was moving this thing around, adjusting the cameras and adjusting all these different settings for how closely it was following you, and where it was focusing, where on the body of the lighthouse it was focusing. You can see that there's all these different numbers here on each one of these points that has all this data associated with it. So like, this is how far behind the camera is, this is how wide that fin is. We later added a vertical fin so that the camera could move up and down off the rail. This was how far along these fins the camera would actually follow you based on how far away from the rail that you went, and various offsets that you could add per point for the camera, like affecting its rotation and roll. And this is also, this bottom number I think is, it's showing like how far off the ground this point is, right? So in certain areas you could keep that number consistent if you wanted the camera to follow the lighthouse at a consistent height, even though the terrain was bumpy. And yeah, it's also not perfect either, because like this preview mode does not take into account all the other cameras that might overlap with it and all the look at targets. So you kind of just have to like play through it, make a tweak, play through it, and see what changes and adjust constantly. Because if I could select all of these at the same time, you would see a variety of fin widths, and figuring out where these things overlapped. I often had to like take screenshots of these two things separately while keeping the camera exactly the same, and then I would put them into Photoshop and just like adjust the opacity so I could kind of get a sense of what they both look like working together. And yeah, it's really just a bunch of that over and over again. You can see, the more complex the space, the more of these camera tracks there are. Yeah, I think last thing I'll just mention that I found really valuable was that there's this option to like visualize these camera triggers in a way that drew like a solid surface to them, so you could actually see where they were lining up with the ground and the world you were walking through. So you can see that as you start to cross over this blue sphere here, we start to blend towards this camera, and then when you're standing inside this yellow one, then we're fully utilizing whatever camera is being referenced by it. So it's all adjusting weights spatially and numerically, and hopefully this stuff is invisible to the player, and provides as seamless an experience as possible. And yeah, I guess we'll leave that up to the players to decide how well they thought we did on that front. But I'm really proud of how this area turned out, and yeah, I don't know. Hopefully, you never struggled with the camera too much. But anyway, that's just an example of how the camera and gameplay work together. Cool. So that was it. Yeah, and thank you all so much for watching, and for those of you that played Keeper, and to everyone on the team that showed you all the different ways we utilized the tools that Unreal offered and the custom things that we built to make the experience that we wanted to deliver to you. And yeah, thanks for playing. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments.